팔레스타인 무장단체 하마스의 기습
이렇게
공격으로
민간인들의 희생이 잇따르면서 국제사회와 주변
레바논의 무장정파 헤즈볼라의 공격으로 2명이 숨지자 이스라엘
And then last week, we talked about replacement theology as well, some of the history of where it began with the Samaritans. The Samaritans were the first people that taught replacement theology. Now, you may be wondering why in the world I have that picture. What is that? It's a T-bone. How many like T-bone steak? But here is the problem. It goes back to perspective. If you focus only on the bone, there's a bone in here. I'm not going to eat it. There's a bone. And you narrow in on that bone and you see it, and I'm not going to eat it. Oh, that's your problem. I'll take the meat around it. But that's what happens with people's perspective on theology. They reject all of Judaism because there's a bone in it. Well, guess what? There's not only bones in Judaism, there's a lot of bones in Christianity. I mean, it's almost like a carp. But, that's got a lot of bones. But so what you have to do is you have to know how to separate. There's bones everywhere, in every religion. But the key is don't focus on the bone. Okay, there's bones in Judaism, there's bones in Christianity, but what we want to look at is the meat. Okay, and there's meat in both. But do you remember, how many of you remember Romans 9, 10, 11? Okay, one of the things that we know from Corinthians, Paul said, we know in part, we see through a glass darkly. Well, guess what? That means we see through a glass darkly. Okay? But we only know in part. Romans 11 says the Jews were only blinded in part. So the Jews are in the same condition the Christians are in. We both see in part. Christians see through this lens, Jews see through this lens. They have a different perspective. And the first group to humble themselves and look out of the other lens gets to see the clear picture. But we have to humble ourselves. We can't say, there's a bone, there's a bone, there's a bone, there's a bone. And the other one goes, there's meat, there's meat, there's meat. But it's both sides. Both sides are looking at the bone in the other rather than the meat in the other. So let's do a quick review from last week. In 2 Kings 17:29, it says, howbeit every nation made gods of their own, put them in the houses of the high places, which the Samaritans had made, every nation in their cities wherein they had dwelt. Okay, so the Samaritans were clear back in 700 BC. The Samaritans had been around a long time, all the way up through Yeshua's time, around 30 of the current era. And if you remember, when did this happen? It's when the Assyrians captured northern Israel. They moved the Israelis to other nations. They took those from other nations and put them in Israel. And then they didn't know how to worship Israel's God. They were eaten by lions, and they go and say, please bring some of them back and teach us how to obey the God of this land. Because back then, everyone thought every country had its own God that had to be worshiped. Now, John, I don't know if you knew, he lived in Ephesus. Okay, here we go. Here is Turkey, and that yellow line is dividing Europe from Asia. Now, many of you may have been with me this last year. We visited all 7 churches in Turkey, and then we went over to Philippi and Athens and Corinth. We visited all of those areas. Well, look at this in John 19:26 and 27. Yeshua's up on the cross. He sees John. It says, when Yeshua saw his mother and the disciple whom he loved standing nearby, he said to his mom, "Woman, behold your son." And he said to the disciple, "Behold your mom." And from that hour, the disciple took her to his own home. As you know, back then, women had no rights. If they didn't have someone to take care of them, they were in trouble. Well, Yeshua put John in charge of his mother. Okay. Well, one of the things that happened is Herod Agrippa started killing all the disciples. And John said, it's time to move. And so John moved up to Ephesus. Okay, that's where he lived. And guess who he took with him? Mary, or Miriam. Here's a picture I took of Ephesus when we were there. We're in the hotel. I'm up, on the higher floor. But here's what Ephesus looks like. And right here is where we immersed about 20 people that were on the trip. And this is the same place that the Apostle Paul immersed people, and they all filled with the Holy Spirit and came out. It was a lot of fun. The Apostle John brought Miriam or Mary to Ephesus after Stephen was stoned. Okay, and James is beheaded. So this is around 37 to 48, about 7 years after Messiah died. Things are getting worse. And Herod Agrippa ruled from 41 to 44. That was the year he was ruling. This is the area where John lived. Of course, it was repaired in the 1st century, repaired again in the 4th century, repaired again in the 7th century, and then it was repaired again around 1951. Roman Emperor Claudius Caesar was the Roman emperor from 41 to 54. He was poisoned by his wife because she wanted her son to be emperor. So she kills her husband and makes her son emperor. After him, many of you have heard of Nero, right? Well, that was Claudius Caesar's wife's son. Nero now becomes the Roman emperor. And guess what he does? After his mother kills her husband and appoints him, he kills his mother. Then he ruled till 68 as Roman emperor. And then comes Vespasian, and he ruled from 69 to 79. The year between 68 and 69 had like 3 Roman emperors who kept killing each other, trying to be the boss. And so then came Vespasian, and from 69 to 79, the temple was destroyed in 70 AD, if you remember. Well, Vespasian had a son named Titus, and he was the next emperor from 79 to 81. So this is all of the 1st century. Who was the king of Judea? Okay, Herod Agrippa I was appointed by Claudius Caesar in the year 41. The same year he became emperor, he appointed Herod Agrippa, who you read in your Bible was from 41 to 44. He's the one who beheads John's brother James, which is why John decided it's time to move to Ephesus. His brother just got beheaded by this guy. So he moves. King Agrippa is the one who imprisons Peter. John ends up moving to Ephesus, and Herod Agrippa is the one who's in Caesarea who dies and all the worms eat him, it talks about. Okay? Well, now here comes Nero, and he's the one who ordered the death of his mother. Well, he began his rule at only 16 years old. And he died by suicide at 30 years old in the year 68, which is when and Rome burns to the ground in 64 CE. And that's when they say he played the fiddle while Rome burned. That's debatable if that's really happened. But he's the Roman emperor who killed his mother. He was only 16 years old. And then after Rome was burned to the ground, 4 years later, he ends up committing suicide at 30 years old. But the thing is, he is the one. And 64 BC, when Rome burnt to the ground, all the believers were the ones that were blamed, that Rome burned. Okay, so now they're getting the heck out of there. So the Messianic Jews fled in 67 to Pella. Okay, that's in the Jordan area up north. It's not Petra, it's Pella. And they go north. Jerusalem, we know, was destroyed in 70 CE. And the reason the Messianic Jews fled, it says in the Gospels, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by the armies, get the heck out of there. So that's what they did 3 years before Jerusalem was destroyed. They left. And this was part of the problem, was that when the Jews were fighting the Romans, they wanted the Messianic Jews to help. And they said, we're out of here. And so that's where some of the obstinacy against each other came, because the Orthodox Jews didn't like the Messianic Jews fleeing during the war. And they say basically on the 9th of Av or whatever, in 70, when the temple was destroyed, there were 1,200,000 Jews died. 1,200,000 Jews were laying dead all around Jerusalem. And so the rest of the Jews, what do? We're out of here. Everybody's getting killed by the Romans. So here they're all fleeing the synagogues, but they're not going after the Gentile believers. And so now the Gentile believers get to move into the synagogues and say, we're the boss. Okay, Agrippa was appointed to his monarchy by Emperor Claudius in 41, but a proud Jew he claimed to be as well. He was a very popular figure among the Jews in Judea. The Orthodox Jews in Judea loved Herod Agrippa because he was getting rid of the Messianic Jews. In Acts 12, 1 through 3, it says, about that time, Herod, the king, laid violent hands on some who belonged to the church. He killed James, the brother of John, with the sword. And when he saw that it pleased the Jews, he proceeded to arrest Peter also. And look, this happened during Passover. That's when this is happening. Well, Herod Agrippa was the grandson of Herod the Great. One of his wives was Miriam, one of the Maccabees. She was a princess from the line of the Maccabees. Well, it was that Agrippa who was even born, they felt, was a miracle in itself. Why? Because Herod the Great murdered his wife, Miriam, and most of her family because he felt that these Maccabees posed a threat to the descendants of Esau, and Herod the Great, is from Edom or Esau. As a matter of fact, Caesar Augustus once made this comment. He said, I would rather be Herod's pig than his son. Because he eats kosher, he won't kill the pig, but he'll kill his own son. Okay, Agrippa managed to survive despite the cruelty of his grandfather, Herod the Great. Now, let me see where I'm at. Okay, let's look at this. In 2 Timothy 4:22, it says, this is the second epistle to Timothy, who was ordained the first bishop of the church of Ephesus, or the Ephesians. Okay, so in Ephesus, we see the first bishop was Timothy. And this is written from Rome when Paul was brought before who? Nero. Okay, so I'm trying to give you a time frame of when all this is going on. The information that we know about John's exile to Patmos, remember John was exiled to Patmos? How long was he there? He was only there like 2 years. And then he got to go back to Ephesus to take care of Mary. All right, I don't know if you knew that, but we're going to go into that. The information we know about John comes from Polycarp. Who has heard of Polycarp? Who has never heard of Polycarp? And who has no idea if they know or not know? I never saw some hands. Okay. Polycarp, this is important. Polycarp knew the Apostle John like I know you, personally. And here's what happened. Let me go here. Okay, you see Titus was 79 to 81, just a few years, and that was Vespasian's son. Well, what happened here in 79 to 81 BC, the non-Jewish believers began to take over leadership, and they had no knowledge of Torah or the Hebrew language, and Greek philosophy is their moral base. And this is why they're taking over the synagogue, as I quoted last week in 1 John 1:9, when Diotrephes was rejecting every Jew who came to the synagogue. He rejected the apostles, and he rejected any Gentiles who wanted the Jews there. So this is what is happening. This is after the destruction of the temple, okay? 10 years after. So the year of 4 emperors is when Nero commits suicide, and he's succeeded by Galba, Otho, and Vitellius, who is succeeded by General Vespasian. And Vespasian is named emperor by the Roman Senate. All these guys were like generals killing each other. And then the Senate picks Vespasian. All right? So the Roman emperor, if you remember, was Claudius Caesar, Nero, Vespasian, Titus. Who comes after Titus? Domitian. And Domitian was Vespasian's other son, who was Titus's brother. All right? And he rules in the 1st century from 81 to 96. He's followed by Nerva, who is from 96 to 98, because Nerva murders Domitian, the Roman emperor. And then he had an adopted son named Trajan, and so he went from 98 to 117. So what I'm trying to do is just kind of give you an idea of the Roman emperors, what's going on historically. We just read about the first bishop of Ephesus. Who is the first bishop of Rome? Well, 81 to 96, it was Domitian who exiled John to Patmos in the year 95. At Patmos, he pens the book of Revelations, but that's when he also appoints Polycarp, who's only 26 years old, to be the bishop of Smyrna. From 88 to 97, at the same time he is the bishop of Smyrna, Clement is called the bishop of Rome. Now, the Catholics like to call him Pope, but he wasn't the Pope. He was a bishop like all the other bishops that were leading other cities. Well, what happens when Nerva becomes Roman emperor in 96, he releases John from Patmos, and then he returns to Ephesus, and that's when he pens the Gospel of John and 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John. And then what happens? The next bishop of Rome is Evaristus, and he was from 97 to 105. But Polycarp is the bishop of Smyrna for a long time, so he is still bishop. Now, one thing I want to point out here, here's Turkey, and these are the 7 churches we visited last year. And so we just found that Polycarp is the bishop of Smyrna. In a little bit, we're going to see his disciple Polycrate is the next bishop of Ephesus after Timothy. All right? Now, do you see how close Ephesus is to Smyrna? It's a few miles is all it is. Okay, now that you have memorized all of that,